The most dangerous lies are the ones no one realizes they're hearing. The chandelier light reflected softly against polished glass as Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair, his $20,000 watch catching the glow with quiet precision, his voice low, controlled, just enough to keep the conversation private from anyone who didn't belong, especially someone like her, standing just inches away with a notepad and a calm expression that never asked questions. Clara Whitmore moved like she always did, measured, silent, her black uniform crisp but unremarkable, the kind of presence people forgot the moment they looked away, and Ethan preferred it that way because invisibility meant safety, meant freedom to speak without consequence, meant he could lean closer to his business partner and murmur details that were never meant for the surface, numbers adjusted slightly, timelines reframed, intentions softened just enough to sound honest, and across the table the investor nodded slowly, unaware that what he was agreeing to wasn't exactly what had been promised 5 minutes earlier. Clara wrote down the order without interrupting, her pen gliding across paper with steady precision, her eyes never lingering too long on any one face, yet missing nothing, not the hesitation in the investor's voice, not the calculated pauses in Ethan's tone, not the subtle shift when truth bent just enough to pass unnoticed. Ethan smiled then, confident, because control felt natural to him, like breathing, like time bending to his schedule, and he continued, layering detail over detail, convinced the room belonged entirely to him, convinced the quiet waitress beside him was exactly what she appeared to be, someone who carried plates, not conversations, someone who heard words but never meaning, someone who would walk away and forget everything by the time she reached the kitchen. But Clara didn't forget. She adjusted the silverware slightly, aligning it with deliberate care, her movements unhurried, almost delicate, as if time moved differently for her, as if she understood something deeper about moments like this, moments where people revealed more than they intended simply because they believed. No one was listening. Ethan reached for his glass, his fingers steady, his mind already several steps ahead, calculating outcomes, imagining signatures on paper, imagining another quiet victory added to a long list no one ever questioned, because no one ever saw the parts he chose to hide. The investor asked one more question, something small, something uncertain, and Ethan answered smoothly, seamlessly, a version of the truth shaped to fit exactly what he needed it to be, and for a second, just a second, the room felt completely still, like everything had aligned perfectly in his favor. Clara placed the glass of water gently in front of him, her fingers brushing the edge of the table for balance, her voice soft when she finally spoke, almost lost beneath the ambient hum of the restaurant, yet clear enough to cut through everything he had just built. That's not what you told him 5 minutes ago. Ethan froze, not visibly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but inside, something paused, recalculated, as his eyes lifted slowly to meet hers, expecting hesitation, expecting apology, expecting correction, but finding none, only a quiet certainty that didn't belong in a room like this, not from someone like her. The investor glanced between them, confusion beginning to surface, subtle but growing. And for the first time that evening, Ethan felt something unfamiliar, not fear, not yet, but a disruption, a shift in rhythm he hadn't planned for. And Clara simply stood there, composed, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral, as if she hadn't just stepped into a conversation she was never supposed to understand, as if she hadn't just touched something he had spent years learning how to conceal. Outside, the city moved as it always did, headlights passing in soft streaks, people rushing toward destinations that felt important in the moment, unaware that inside this quiet corner of a high-end restaurant, control had just slipped, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to change everything that came next. The silence did not break all at once. It stretched, thin and fragile, like glass under pressure, and Ethan Caldwell understood something in that instant that most people in the room did not, that the danger was not in what she said, but in how easily she said it, without hesitation, without apology, as if correcting him was no different than adjusting a misplaced fork. And across from him the investor shifted slightly, his confidence no longer steady, his eyes narrowing with the kind of quiet doubt that could unravel an entire deal if given enough time. Ethan set his glass down with controlled precision, the soft clink against the table the only sound he allowed himself, his expression composed, almost amused, because losing control in public was never an option, not for someone who had built his reputation on certainty, on always being the smartest voice in the room. And he turned to Clara with a measured glance, one that had unsettled board members and competitors alike. But she did not react. She simply stood there, waiting, as if the moment belonged to her now. "I think you misunderstood," he said smoothly, his tone calm, deliberate, crafted to restore order. And for a second it almost worked, because that was what he did. He redirected, he reframed, he made people question their own instincts. But Clara did not look confused. She did not look uncertain. She looked at him the way someone looks at a completed equation, already solved, already understood. "You adjusted the timeline," she replied quietly, her voice steady, not loud, not confrontational, just precise. "5 minutes ago, you said the rollout would begin in Q2, but just now you told him Q3, and you did not mention the supply constraints you discussed earlier." The words landed gently, almost politely, but they carried weight, and the investor leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping once against the table as realization began to take shape. Ethan felt it then, the shift, subtle but undeniable, the moment when control no longer flowed in one direction. And he recognized it because he had created it countless times himself, only never from the other side, never as the one being observed instead of the one orchestrating. He studied her more carefully now, not as background, not as noise, but as a variable he had failed to account for, and something about her composure did not fit. The way she held eye contact just long enough, the way she spoke only when necessary, the absence of any need to impress or defend herself. It was not accidental, it was practiced. The investor cleared his throat softly. "Is that accurate?" he asked, his voice no longer casual, and Ethan turned back to him with a slight smile, the kind that reassured without answering directly, buying time, recalibrating. "We are discussing flexible projections," he said, choosing his words carefully. But even as he spoke, he knew the foundation had shifted, because doubt, once introduced, did not leave easily. Clara reached for the check presenter, her movements as calm as ever, and placed it neatly at the edge of the table, her fingers lingering for just a moment longer than necessary, not to draw attention, but to anchor the moment. And when she stepped back, she did not leave. She remained within reach of the conversation, not intruding, not retreating, simply present in a way that made ignoring her impossible. Ethan's mind moved quickly, faster than most could follow, retracing every word he had said, every detail he had chosen to reveal or conceal, searching for the exact point where she had begun to understand, and more importantly, how much she actually knew. Because this was no longer about a single correction. This was about exposure, about the possibility that what he had considered invisible was now fully seen. The investor closed the folder in front of him slowly, the sound deliberate, signaling a pause rather than a conclusion, and looked at Ethan with a different kind of attention, one that measured instead of trusted. And in that quiet shift, Ethan realized something far more unsettling than a disrupted deal. He realized that for the first time in a long time, someone in the room was not reacting to him. They were ahead of him, and Clara Whitmore, with her calm posture and steady gaze, had not raised her voice, had not challenged him directly, but had done something far more dangerous. She had changed the direction of the room without asking for permission. The room did not return to normal. It adjusted, carefully, cautiously, like a system recalibrating after an unexpected input. And Ethan Caldwell recognized the pattern immediately, because he had forced rooms into this exact state before. Only now he was the one being measured, not the one doing the measuring. He leaned back slightly, not retreating but creating space, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested control even when the variables had shifted, and his eyes moved to Clara again, not dismissing her this time, not overlooking her, but studying her with the quiet intensity he reserved for problems that required solving. "Interesting observation," he said, his voice even, almost appreciative, as if he were acknowledging a clever remark rather than addressing a disruption, because reframing was still his strongest tool, turning exposure into conversation, turning uncertainty into something manageable. But Clara did not respond immediately. She let the words settle, let the silence do its work, and that alone told him more than any explanation could have. The investor leaned forward again, slower now, more deliberate, his earlier ease replaced by calculation. "I prefer clarity," he said, his tone polite but firm, and Ethan nodded once, as if that had been his intention all along, as if nothing had been altered. Yet inside his mind moved faster, tracing the edges of what had just happened, identifying the gap, the moment she had stepped in, the precision of her correction, and most importantly, the confidence behind it, because confidence without verification was noise, but confidence paired with accuracy was something else entirely. Clara reached for a water pitcher, refilling the glasses with steady hands, her movements unhurried, unaffected by the shift she had created, and Ethan noticed the details now. The way she listened without appearing to listen, the way she positioned herself within the conversation without ever claiming it. It was not accidental. It was intentional, refined, practiced over time. "You mentioned supply constraints," the investor continued, directing the question back to Ethan, but his gaze flickered briefly toward Clara, not seeking confirmation, but acknowledging a new point of reference, and that was the real shift. Ethan realized, not the words she had spoken, but the credibility she had established in a single moment. Ethan exhaled slowly, controlled, then leaned forward again, adjusting the narrative with precision. "There are variables in any rollout," he said, choosing transparency where it now served him, adjusting without admitting fault, because adaptation was the difference between those who lost control and those who redefined it. Yet even as he spoke, he was aware that the balance had changed, that every word now carried weight it had not carried before, because it was no longer accepted by default. Clara placed the pitcher back down and stepped slightly to the side, her presence still within reach, still part of the equation. And for a brief moment, their eyes met again, and this time Ethan did not look away first, not out of challenge, but out of recognition, because whatever she was not what she appeared to be. The investor nodded slowly, absorbing the revised explanation, but he did not reopen his folder, not yet. Instead, he rested his hands on the table, fingers interlaced, a pause that signaled reconsideration rather than agreement, and Ethan knew that pause. He had created it in others countless times, the moment where trust was no longer assumed but evaluated. "I would like to review the full terms again," the investor said finally, his voice calm but definitive, and Ethan inclined his head slightly, accepting the request with the composure of someone who had already adjusted the outcome in his favor. Even if the path had changed, Clara picked up the check presenter again, her fingers brushing the edge as she turned slightly away, ready to step back into the background where she technically belonged. But the moment did not release her so easily, because Ethan spoke again, not to the investor, but to her, his tone quieter now, more direct. "How did you know?" he asked, and it was not a challenge, not an accusation. It was a question he rarely asked anyone, because he rarely needed answers. Yet this time he did. Clara paused, just for a second, her hand still resting lightly against the table, and when she turned back, her expression was the same as before, calm, composed, almost gentle, but her answer did not rush. It arrived exactly when it needed to. "You said enough," she replied, and there was no emphasis, no explanation, just a simple truth that carried more weight than anything else spoken that evening. And Ethan understood then that this was not about one conversation, it was about a pattern, about someone who had been listening longer than he had realized, someone who did not need access to power to understand it, someone who simply paid attention, and in that realization, something shifted again, quieter this time, but deeper, because control could be reclaimed, narratives could be adjusted, deals could be rewritten, but being truly seen, that was something far more difficult to reverse. Control did not return, it evolved, and Ethan Caldwell understood that evolution required a different kind of response, not force, not dismissal, but precision, the kind that acknowledged a shift without surrendering to it. And he straightened slightly, adjusting the cuff of his shirt as if the moment had simply required a minor correction. Yet his attention remained fixed on Clara Whitmore in a way it had not before, because her answer had not been defensive, not explanatory, just a statement that implied something far more complex. that she had not reacted to what he said. She had anticipated it. The investor gathered his papers slowly, not closing the conversation but pausing it, the kind of pause that carried weight. "I will have my team review everything in detail," he said, his tone measured, respectful, but no longer aligned, and Ethan nodded once, accepting it without resistance. Because resistance would only confirm what had already been introduced, doubt. Clara stepped back. Then, finally allowing distance to form between her and the table, her role returning to what it was supposed to be, invisible, peripheral, yet the room did not forget her presence. Not completely, not after what she had revealed with such quiet certainty. Ethan reached for the check presenter, his fingers brushing the smooth leather surface before opening it, more out of habit than necessity, and inside, beneath the neatly printed receipt, something else caught his attention, a small folded slip of paper, precise, deliberate, placed where it would not be noticed unless someone was looking for more than the obvious. And Ethan was always looking for more than the obvious. He unfolded it carefully, his expression unchanged, but his focus sharpened, the room fading slightly as the words on the page came into view. Not many. Just a single line written in clean, controlled handwriting. "You adjusted the margin by 3%, not 2. And for the first time that evening, Ethan did not respond immediately, because that detail had not been spoken aloud, not in this room, not in any part of the conversation. It had existed only in his internal calculation, in the quiet space where strategy formed before it was shared, and that realization did not disrupt him. It deepened the question. He closed the presenter slowly, his mind already reconstructing the sequence, identifying what had been visible, what had been implied, what had been entirely concealed. And then he looked up, not at the investor, not at the room, but at Clara, who was now several steps away, attending to another table with the same calm efficiency, as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just stepped into a space she was never meant to access. Ethan stood then, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with intention, adjusting his jacket as he moved, his steps measured as he crossed the distance between them, not to confront, not to challenge, but to understand, because understanding was the only way to regain control, and control, even in altered form, was something he did not relinquish easily. Clara sensed him before he spoke, not by sound, but by presence, the subtle shift in the room that followed him, and she turned slightly, meeting his gaze without surprise, without anticipation, simply acknowledging that the moment had arrived. "You wrote that," he said quietly, holding the folded note between his fingers, his voice lower now, stripped of performance, of audience, and Clara glanced at it briefly, then back at him, her expression unchanged. "Yes," she replied, and there was no hesitation, no attempt to soften the truth, because she did not need to. Ethan studied her for a moment longer, searching for something that explained the precision, the confidence, the awareness that extended beyond what she should have access to. But explanations required assumptions, and assumptions were exactly what had led him here. "You were not part of that discussion," he said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. And Clara tilted her head slightly, considering the wording, not the implication. "No," she said, "but you were." And that was the difference, the line that separated information from understanding, that being present was not the same as being aware, and Ethan felt it again, that subtle shift, not in the room this time, but in his own perspective, because for the first time, he was not trying to control the narrative, he was trying to see it from the outside, the way she had. The ambient noise of the restaurant continued around them, glasses clinking, conversations blending into a low, steady rhythm. But between them, there was a different kind of silence, one that did not need to be filled, one that carried its own weight, and Ethan realized something then, not fully, not completely, but enough to recognize that this was no longer about a single deal or a single moment. It was about a pattern he had overlooked, a variable he had dismissed, and a person who had been present the entire time, not interfering, not interrupting, simply observing, waiting. And when she finally spoke again, her voice was as calm as it had been from the beginning. "People always say more than they think," she said, and then she turned back to her work, leaving Ethan standing there with a note in his hand and a realization he could not easily set aside. The note did not feel like evidence. It felt like confirmation, and Ethan Caldwell stood there for a moment longer than he intended, the folded paper still between his fingers, as the quiet rhythm of the restaurant continued around him, unchanged, indifferent, and that was what made it more unsettling, because nothing external had shifted, only his understanding of it had. He slipped the note back into the check presenter with deliberate care, as if placing it out of sight could somehow return the balance that had been there before, but he knew better. Balance once altered did not simply reset, it adapted, and so did he. He turned back toward the table, his posture composed, his expression neutral, the version of himself the world recognized still fully intact. Yet his focus had shifted entirely, no longer on the deal, no longer on the investor, but on the pattern that had just revealed itself through someone he had overlooked. The investor stood as Ethan approached, offering a polite handshake, one that signaled professionalism rather than agreement. "We will reconnect after a full review," he said, and Ethan returned the gesture with the same measured confidence. "Of course," he replied, his tone steady, unaffected, because outcomes could change without altering presence, and presence was what people remembered. As the investor exited the restaurant, the space around Ethan felt larger, quieter, not empty, but open in a way that invited reflection, and Ethan did not leave immediately. He rarely did when something unresolved remained. Instead, he sat back down, his gaze drifting across the room until it found Clara again, moving between tables with the same calm precision, unaffected by the shift she had created, or perhaps simply unbothered by it. He watched her for a moment, not in curiosity anymore, but in analysis, the kind that stripped away assumption and focused only on observable truth, her timing, her awareness, the way she positioned herself within conversations without ever claiming them. It was not reactive behavior, it was strategic, quiet, controlled in its own way. A manager passed by, stopping briefly at Ethan's table with a polite smile. "Was everything satisfactory this evening, Mr. Caldwell?" he asked, and Ethan nodded once, his eyes still tracking Clara in the distance. "Yes," he said. Then after a brief pause, "Who is she?" The question came out evenly, not urgent, not demanding, but intentional, and the manager followed his gaze, glancing toward Clara before answering. "Clara Whitmore. She has been with us about a year, reliable, keeps to herself," and that was all. A surface description that explained nothing and yet confirmed something important, that whatever Clara was, she had chosen to remain exactly where she appeared to be. Ethan leaned back slightly, absorbing the information, or rather the lack of it, because absence of detail was its own kind of signal, and he had built entire strategies on less. Clara approached the table again, not summoned, not hesitating, simply continuing her work as if their earlier exchange had been no more significant than any other part of her shift. "Will there be anything else?" she asked, her voice calm, professional, unchanged, and Ethan looked up at her, not as a customer now, but as someone recalibrating an equation. "Yes," he said quietly, his tone different, less performative, more direct. "There is." And for the first time that evening, the question he asked next was not designed to control the outcome, but to understand it. "You noticed a detail I did not say out loud," he continued, his gaze steady. "That is not something most people catch." And Clara held his gaze for a brief moment, not challenged, not impressed, simply acknowledging the statement for what it was. She did not answer immediately, and in that pause, Ethan recognized the same pattern again. She did not speak to fill space. She spoke when it mattered, and when she finally did, her words were as measured as before. "Most people listen for what they expect," she said, her tone soft but certain. "I listen for what changes." And there it was again, not explanation, not justification, just a principle, simple, clear, and far more revealing than anything else she could have said. And Ethan understood then that this was not coincidence, not intuition alone, but discipline, the kind that came from experience, from repetition, from a past that did not align with the role she currently held. He nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition, because whatever this was, it was not random, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan Caldwell was no longer the only one in the room who understood how to read between the lines. The difference between curiosity and control is subtle, but Ethan Caldwell felt it. Clearly now, the shift from directing a conversation to studying it. And as Clara Whitmore stepped back from the table, returning to her rhythm, he realized something he had not needed to consider in years, that not every advantage announced itself. Some simply existed, quiet, consistent, waiting for the right moment to reveal their impact. He remained seated for a moment longer, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, not distracted, not uncertain, but recalibrating, because every system, no matter how refined, required adjustment when a new variable proved significant, and Clara was no longer a variable he could ignore. The restaurant carried on around him, the low hum of conversations blending with the soft clink of glassware, a controlled environment where everything appeared predictable, and yet within that predictability, something unexpected had taken place, not loud, not disruptive, but precise enough to alter the outcome of a negotiation that had been, until minutes ago, entirely within his control. He stood slowly, buttoning his jacket with practiced ease, and walked toward the exit, but not directly. His path angled just enough to pass by the service station where Clara was organizing receipts, her focus steady, her posture relaxed, as if she existed outside the tension she had created. "You are not just observant," Ethan said quietly as he approached, his tone even, not accusatory, not impressed, simply factual, and Clara glanced up, briefly, acknowledging him without surprise. "Observation is a habit," she replied, returning her attention to the stack of papers in front of her, her voice calm, as if the statement required no further explanation. Ethan studied her for a moment, the simplicity of her response contrasting sharply with the complexity of its implication, because habits were formed over time, shaped by repetition, refined through experience, and whatever her past was, it had trained her to notice what others overlooked, to hear what others dismissed, to connect details most people never realized were connected. "Habits come from somewhere," he said, his gaze steady, and this time Clara paused, not long, just enough to consider the direction of the conversation, before setting the papers down with deliberate care, aligning them neatly before responding. "So do assumptions," she said, and there was no edge in her tone, no challenge, just a quiet redirection that shifted the focus back to him without effort. Ethan exhaled softly, not in frustration, but in recognition, because she was not avoiding the question, she was reframing it, choosing what to engage with and what to leave unanswered, a skill he knew well, a skill he respected, even when it was used against him. A server passed by, calling Clara's name softly, reminding her of another table, and she nodded, stepping away without urgency, without hesitation, leaving Ethan standing there with a conversation that had not concluded but had already revealed more than most ever did. He watched her go, not with curiosity now, but with understanding, or at least the beginning of it, because whatever role she held in this place, it was not the one that defined her, it was simply the one she allowed people to see. Outside, the evening air carried a quiet coolness as Ethan stepped onto the sidewalk, the city lights reflecting off passing cars, the movement steady, predictable, and for the first time that night, he did not reach for his phone, did not check the time, did not immediately move on to the next task. Instead, he stood still for a moment, considering the shift that had taken place, not in the deal, not in the room, but in his own perception. Control, he realized, was not just about information, it was about awareness, about knowing what mattered before it was said, before it was revealed, and Clara Whitmore, with her quiet presence and measured words, had demonstrated something he had not expected to encounter in a place like this, not opposition, not defiance, but precision, the kind that did not need authority to be effective. He adjusted his cuff once more, a familiar gesture grounding his thoughts, and as he began to walk away, one realization settled clearly in his mind, not loud, not dramatic, but certain, that the next time he entered that restaurant, it would not be to close a deal, it would be to understand the one person who had seen through it before it was even spoken. The next evening did not arrive with urgency. It arrived with intention, and Ethan Caldwell stepped into the restaurant a few minutes past 7, not because of a reservation, not because of a meeting, but because unanswered questions had a way of demanding presence, and he had learned long ago that clarity rarely came from distance. The hostess greeted him with recognition, offering a table near the center of the room. But Ethan paused for a fraction of a second, his eyes scanning the space. With quiet precision, not searching for status, not assessing the crowd, but locating a single point of focus. And when he found it, he nodded once, accepting the table without adjustment. Clara Whitmore moved between tables with the same steady rhythm, her pace unhurried, her attention divided yet complete, and if she noticed his arrival, she did not show it, not immediately, because awareness, as she had demonstrated, did not require reaction. Ethan took his seat, placing his phone face down. On the table, an uncommon choice for someone who measured time and opportunities, but this was not about time. It was about observation, and for once, he allowed the room to unfold without interference. He watched the details, the way conversations overlapped, the way decisions were made in small gestures, a nod here, a pause there, and he noticed something he had overlooked before, that Clara did not simply move through the space. She navigated it, adjusting her position with subtle intent, arriving at moments just before they required her presence, leaving just after they no longer did, as if she followed a pattern invisible to everyone else. When she finally approached his table, there was no hesitation, no shift in expression, just the same calm professionalism that defined her role. "Good evening," she said, her voice even, her posture relaxed, and Ethan looked up, meeting her gaze with a different kind of focus, one that no longer assumed, no longer dismissed. "I would like the same table," he said, then corrected himself slightly. "The same conversation." And for a brief moment, something almost like recognition passed through her eyes, not surprise, not curiosity, but acknowledgement. She did not respond to the phrasing. She simply noted the order, her pen moving across the page with quiet precision, and Ethan allowed the silence to settle, because he understood now that silence was not empty, it was deliberate. "You were not surprised to see me," he said after a moment, not as a question, but as an observation. And Clara placed the pen down gently before meeting his gaze again. "You returned," she said, as if that explained everything, as if patterns were more predictable than people believed. Ethan leaned back slightly, considering the simplicity of her response, because it was not avoidance, it was alignment. She did not answer what he asked, she addressed what mattered, and that difference was not accidental. Most people would not. He continued, his tone calm. "After what happened yesterday." And Clara tilted her head slightly, not dismissing the statement, but refining it. "Most people are not looking for what they missed," she replied, her voice steady. And again, there was no emphasis, no need to prove a point, just a quiet truth placed exactly where it belonged. Ethan exhaled softly, not out of frustration, but out of recognition, because this was not a conversation built on exchange, it was one built on layers, each response revealing something just beneath the surface, never more than necessary, never less than precise. A server passed by, placing a glass of water on the table, the movement seamless, unnoticed by most. But Ethan saw it now, the coordination, the timing, the awareness that extended beyond individual roles, and he understood something else, that Clara did not stand apart from the system. She understood it, fully, completely, and chose how to move within it. "You knew before I spoke," he said quietly, bringing the focus back to the moment that had shifted everything. And Clara did not deny it. She did not confirm it directly either. Instead, she reached for the edge of the table, aligning a misplaced napkin with careful precision before responding. "You had already decided," she said, her tone calm. "I just listened to how you got there." And that was it. No elaboration, no justification, just a statement that reframed the entire situation, not as a mistake, not as exposure, but as inevitability. And Ethan felt it again, that subtle shift, not in control this time, but in understanding, because for the first time, he was not trying to stay ahead, he was trying to catch up. Understanding did not arrive all at once, it formed slowly, like a pattern revealing itself only after enough pieces had been placed, and Ethan Caldwell sat there with a stillness that would have been unfamiliar to anyone who knew him outside this room, because stillness was not something he relied on, it was something he usually disrupted. Clara Whitmore moved away from the table again, her role unchanged on the surface, her attention shifting seamlessly to another group of guests, and yet, Ethan did not feel dismissed. He felt repositioned, as if the conversation had not ended but expanded beyond a single exchange. He watched her from a distance now, not searching for answers in her words, but in her process, the way she listened before speaking, the way she allowed others to reveal themselves without interruption, and for the first time, he recognized that what he had always considered control was only one side of the equation. The other side was awareness, and she had mastered it without ever needing to claim it. A couple at a nearby table hesitated over their order, their conversation quiet but uncertain, and Clara approached at exactly the right moment. Not too early, not too late, offering a suggestion that resolved their indecision in seconds, and Ethan noticed the pattern again, not influence, not persuasion, but timing, precision applied without force. He leaned forward slightly, his fingers resting against the edge of the table, his gaze no longer fixed on her alone, but on the entire room, because she had changed the way he saw it, not as a space he controlled, but as a system he had not fully understood. When she returned, placing a simple plate in front of him with the same measured calm, he did not look at the food. He looked at her. "You do not correct people often," he said, his tone quiet, observational, and Clara paused. Briefly, not surprised by the statement, but considering its weight before responding. "Only when it matters," she said, and the simplicity of it carried more meaning than any detailed explanation could have. Ethan nodded once, slowly, because that answer aligned with everything he had seen. She was not reactive, she was selective, and that distinction was what made her effective. "Yesterday mattered," he continued, not as a question, but as a recognition, and Clara met his gaze for a fraction. Longer this time, just enough to confirm without stating it directly. "It changed more than you think," she replied, her voice calm, and there was no emphasis, no need to highlight the significance, because the significance was already present. Ethan leaned back slightly, absorbing the statement, not challenging it, not dismissing it, because he understood now that impact was not always immediate. Sometimes it unfolded over time, reshaping decisions that had not yet been made. "The investor," he said, shifting the focus. "He will walk away." And Clara did not correct him. She did not agree either. Instead, she adjusted the position of the glass on the table, aligning it with the edge before speaking. "He will reconsider," she said, her tone steady, "but not in the way you planned." And again, the words were not dramatic, not forceful, but they carried a certainty that came from observation rather than assumption. Ethan allowed a small pause to settle between them, because he recognized something in her response that he had not expected, not prediction, but pattern recognition, the kind that came from seeing how decisions formed before they were finalized. "You are not guessing," he said quietly, and Clara shook her head once, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "No," she replied. "People rarely change direction, they adjust within it." And that was the moment Ethan understood the depth of what she was saying, that influence did not always come from altering a path. Sometimes it came from understanding the path so well that every adjustment became predictable. The ambient noise of the restaurant continued, steady, consistent, but for Ethan, the environment had shifted. Entirely, not in structure, but in meaning, because he was no longer observing outcomes. He was observing the process that created them. And Clara Whitmore, without raising her voice, without stepping outside her role, had revealed something far more valuable than any single deal. She had shown him the space between decision and action, the place where control was not asserted, but earned through awareness. And as she stepped away once more, leaving him with his thoughts and a perspective he could not ignore, Ethan realized that this was no longer about understanding her. It was about understanding everything he had missed before. Closure did not arrive with a final statement. It arrived with a quiet shift in perspective, and Ethan Caldwell remained seated long after the plate in front of him had gone untouched, not because he had forgotten it, but because for once, his attention was not on what was in front of him. It was on what had been revealed around him. Clara Whitmore moved through the restaurant as she always had, her rhythm unchanged, her presence steady, and yet Ethan no longer saw her as part of the background. He saw her as part of the structure, someone who understood the flow of decisions before they fully formed, someone who did not interrupt outcomes but refined the moment that created them. He reached for the check presenter again, opening it slowly, not out of habit this time, but with intention, and inside, there was nothing unusual, no note, no correction, just the receipt, precise and final, and for a brief moment, that absence felt more significant than anything she had written before. Because it meant the conversation had already reached its conclusion, Clara approached one last time, her posture composed, her voice calm. "Whenever you are ready," she said, and Ethan looked up at her, holding her gaze not as a challenge, not as a question, but as recognition, because he understood now that what had happened between them was not a disruption, it was a recalibration. He signed the receipt with deliberate care, placing the pen down slowly, and as he slid the presenter back toward her, his voice carried a quiet clarity that had not been there before. "You did not expose anything," he said, and Clara paused, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, listening, and Ethan continued, "You just made it visible." And for the first time, there was something almost like a response in her expression, not a smile, not agreement, but acknowledgement, as if the statement aligned with something she had known all along. She picked up the presenter, her movements as measured as ever, and for a moment, it seemed as if she might say something more, something that would extend the conversation beyond this point. But she did not. She simply nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and stepped back, allowing the moment to settle without adding to it. Ethan stood then, adjusting his jacket with the same practiced motion, but the gesture carried a different weight now, not routine, not automatic, but intentional, as if even the smallest actions required awareness. He walked toward the exit, not hurried, not delayed. And as he reached the door, he paused briefly, not turning back, not seeking confirmation, but acknowledging something internally, a shift that did not need to be seen to exist. Outside, the city moved as it always did, headlights passing in steady lines, people navigating their own decisions, their own conversations, their own assumptions, and Ethan stepped into that flow with a different understanding, not of control, but of awareness, because control, he realized, was only effective when it was informed by what others overlooked. Inside, Clara returned to her work, her role unchanged, her presence quiet, and yet the impact of what she had done did not remain in the room. It extended beyond it, carried forward in the way one person chose to see differently. And as the evening continued, as conversations rose and fell, as decisions formed and shifted, one truth remained, not spoken, not emphasized, but understood in the silence between moments, that the most powerful change does not come from being heard. It comes from understanding what others fail to notice and choosing exactly